Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chad Koulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber of Commerce. And this is our first book club that I believe we've ever done. And our book is The Leader's Journey, which is by our former board member, Dr. Artika Tyner. And I want to kick things off by turning it over to Dr. Tyner right now, who's going to give a little bit of an introduction. And then after that, we are going to turn to some questions. I've got a lot of questions for her, but I also encourage the rest of you to put questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. So Dr. Tyner.
Thank you. I appreciate the warm welcome. And I know one of the things that I always like to remind people that readers are leaders. So when we look at this specifically and connect it to our leadership roles, this is a unique opportunity with a book club. I hope to see a wonderful continuation and participate in the Chamber's book club myself in the future, because I think it's important to be able to set a firm foundation around being able to effectively lead, build strategic connections. And if we look at the role of the Chamber around supporting business, around supporting our local economy, but also strengthening the social fabric of the Hamlin Midway community, which I'm a direct beneficiary of as a proud daughter of Rondo and someone who still lives in this community. So when I think about the leader's journey, it was a unique opportunity for me to shed light on some of the research that I was doing. I earned my dissertation, doctoral studies in educational leadership, and I was really exploring what are those key leadership skills that we need? What are those characteristics? And more importantly for me was the additional notion, because I'm also a civil rights attorney, on how do you leverage leadership to build and sustain social change, which of course is a timely question for us right now as well. So as we look at the future of the book and next steps on what I plan on writing and the research that I will be disseminating, my next book will be released in March. It'll focus on leadership strategies for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. To me, once again, it's something near and dear to my heart as we think about the changing landscape of our communities and how do we grab a hold of it as an opportunity, as a strength, as a part of creating vibrant local economies. How does it all tie together? So I'll just start off with a brief introduction. I hope it sparks some questions that you're either willing to share in the chat or to raise once I finish with just this brief presentation of context of the future of leadership. So when we think about it, can you imagine? This is a world of possibilities. But as you look at each three of these components, you get a greater profitability, greater productivity, improved employee recruitment and retention, a stronger local economy, all of these things. So this is the research combination from greater MSP and great places to work. The theme that aligns all three of these components throughout, you may have guessed it already, diversity and inclusion. When we think about this, study after study shows us the power of diversity in the boardroom, the power of diversity in our general brainstorming, strategic planning sessions, when we're creating new products and services, the tangible pieces in recent years, now we can document of how it improves our bottom line. And when I'm talking about our bottom line, just not monetarily, I think it's the strength of our democracy. I think it's the strength of our communities, but it's oftentimes a conversation that's overlooked. We'll jump into a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll start talking about employee resource groups. We'll start talking about hiring our next chief diversity officer, or if we're looking at maybe doing a training around implicit bias or around microaggressions. But I challenge you to step back and look at the whole picture. Those are all wonderful things. They're all components of being an inclusive leader and building an inclusive workplace. But I think a piece of it is oftentimes we are looking at it through a deficit model, of the sense of maybe we can do something to lead and bring forth change. But my challenge for you as it relates to the leader's journey is, first of all, I don't think it's an option at this point. I think it's out of necessity where we sit right now in St. Paul. We know based upon the data alone in the category of race and ethnicity that we are a majority minority city. So it means that our landscape has already changed. But the question then for us as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, as researchers, as members of the community is how do we embrace the rapid changes in meaningful ways? So you may be saying, well, Dr. Tyner, what does that really look like? That is the notion of not only why I wrote The Leader's Journey, but also our series of children's books to position all of us to maybe get outside of our comfort zone, to be willing to learn, to be willing to take on new challenges, but more importantly, to be able to embrace the fullness of our shared humanity and common destiny. If we're going to make an economy work, it will take everyone. If we're going to make a democracy work, it will take everyone, and it will take you and I to help be those influencers, those change agents to make it come alive. Now, in case you're not convinced yet, here's a little bit of research from Great Place to Work. They're a research team. I highly recommend looking at their annual reports, but it gives you a sense, and you can take a glimpse at this yourself. Now, primarily, my work focuses on racial and ethnic diversity, but you see that companies with greater gender diversity are outperforming companies with less gender diversity in particular. One of the things that you'll see is a bit of the challenges in the fourth bullet is that despite all of our good efforts, there's still this idea of how can we prioritize these pieces to make it not this other thing, but make it a part of actually the vibrancy of the organizations that we are in, the ones that we'll create, not just for the present, but also for the future. So drawing upon the strengths, that's the difference between the inclusion proposition versus diversity. Diversity focuses on primarily representation. It's squarely looking primarily at the numbers, right? But inclusion is about the experience. It's about the opportunities that we create. And I don't know about you, I was shouting quite loud from my office yesterday to see the announcement of the new CEO of Walgreens, not just because I'm an African-American female, but because I'm a researcher. I've been looking at the data. I encourage you to follow the data if you're interested in being a more inclusive leader from an organization called Korn Ferry. So when you look at their research in particular, one of the things that they were concerned about is Ursula Burns. We know her as the former CEO of Xerox and really has been a trailblazer. But the reality of it was we were going from, in just a couple decades period, from 10 African-American CEOs to 3, and then potentially, without having a very clear pipeline, we weren't sure the future of having African-Americans in strategic CEO roles. Now, here's my hypothesis. One of the things that I'm studying in my research, a part of that challenge is when we think about the diversity piece, we're willing to talk about the numbers, but when we get into the equity and the inclusion piece, are we truly creating equal access to the mobility for key strategic leadership roles? From my experience, the answer is a resounding no, because if we look at the data around just who is in that pipeline, we see that we are not being consistent. Although we espouse these are all values, we are not being consistent in creating those leadership succession plans. We're not consistent related to our mentorship and engagement to be able to mentor and support and foster growth where there is talent. So I want to say kudos to Walgreens and kudos to other corporations that are opening up not just those CEO positions, the board positions as well, bringing diversity in corporate boards and creating those pipelines. Because unfortunately, it's easy to be able to say, we saw it in the news less than 6 months ago, this idea of a CEO saying we cannot find diverse talent. The question is, where are you looking? The question is, have you committed to cultivating that talent? Another question that we have to think about, have we committed to inclusion? That way someone with the talent would even want to work with us or be a part of our organization. So these are the lingering questions that I hope that you'll continue to think about and how you can lead the way. What we do need to know, like I said, this is not optional, this is out of necessity, that the landscape is changing. I think Bob Dylan said it best, times are changing. We know that the United States is both browning and aging. So when we look at this, I put some of the growth trends that we're seeing just in the category related to race and ethnicity, the browning piece. And I'll just leave it open to the last portion here of asking the question. With current population projections, the US will no longer have an ethnic majority by year blank. Any guesses or estimates of what that year will be? Now, the last time I was lecturing before our esteemed colleagues here at the Midway Chamber of Commerce, I will tell you the speculations were either 2060 or 2050. Any guesses of what the year is?
I think it's just several years away.
I think 2025.
2025, okay, several years away. So when we're looking at this specifically, clearly, John and Gail, you've been doing your homework and your eyes are wide open. When we struck 2019, the data had already shown us when we were striking that midnight piece and getting excited to cheer in the new year, that the vast majority of new births would be children of color. Now, based upon the projections, and we will see an update with the next US Census report, the current projections from the last census report was that it would be 2043. But clearly from the response of both John and Gail, we know that it's coming sooner rather than later. Now, is this something that we will fear and have doubts, saying we don't know what to do, we don't know how to serve clients from diverse populations, we don't have anyone on our team? Or will we pause and say, this is an opportunity to help connect, to help make inclusion come alive in meaningful ways? So we have this piece related to the changing cultural landscape as it relates to race and ethnicity, but the other portion of that slide also talked about aging. This is the first time that we will see that there are 5 generations in the workplace today all at once. Why do I bring this up? Because we know that we have the increasing diversity at, of course, based upon trends, based upon growth rates from the previous slide. So we have a diversity in our youth, and going from that Gen Y, Gen X, Gen Z, we understand that. But as a whole, here's a challenge for you as a leader as well. How do you embrace the talents of each of these groups of individuals to have 5 generations in the workplace? Now, going in as a researcher, studying workplaces, studying organizational development, I think most organizations are not cognizant of either one. And when I say not cognizant of either one, I'm talking about the premise of America browning and aging. They know it as a general sense. Maybe you've read something, maybe you've gone to a seminar, but when I talk about really engaging as a leader, that's something different. How will it impact how you serve your clients, your customers? How does it impact how you recruit new employees, how you create a leadership pipeline? These are other questions to consider. And without considering those 2 pieces and everything that you're doing, you will be missing an important part of your work to be able to engage strategically. So when I prepared the second edition of the Leader's Journey, I included those 2 components, but I also included in the second edition a whole new piece that focused on global connections. I don't want us to miss this. Although we're looking at the changing cultural landscape right here in the Midway and Minnesota beyond, I also don't want you to lose clear vision around what is happening when we hear those words. We're living in a globalized economy. So this gives you a sense of course, it was a little shocking to me when I first started doing this research and comparing and contrasting where the next mega cities would be, where was the fastest growth related to GDP. And all of a sudden, for me, I still thought the mega cities would be places like New York City, Chicago, some of those hubs of industry and commerce. Wow, was it eye-opening to see that many of those mega cities are no longer in the United States. And also for the second bullet point here, of which country will outpace the US for being the 3rd most populous nation in the world. Any guesses on this particular piece?
Are China and India the top 2?
Yes.
My guess is Mexico.
Your guess is Mexico? Okay. Anyone else? We got Mexico on the list. No,
Sure, it says Brazil.
Brazil, okay. You're getting on the list of probably the top 10 roughly. So when you put these all together, you clearly can see a changing landscape. And here's the one that no one expected. In fact, Time magazine predicted it early on. And they were looking at the new innovations that were happening in technology, the growth in the economy. It's Nigeria. Aha. And which is interesting for most folks because they oftentimes get lost and forget that Africa is a continent with countries, right? So Nigeria then being its own country is outpacing the United States in growth and population. And many studies are also predicting, as it relates to their rise in their economy as well, that we will see some new things emerging throughout West Africa and, of course, Nigeria. Now, one of the pieces that you also want to think about, if we look at the bottom here, if you look at some of the studies now, just an interesting piece. I know with COVID, many of us are planning our next vacation. On the top list of one of the most beautiful cities to visit and one of the most beautiful countries to visit now, we have Rwanda. So it's something to be said that even tourism is changing the very nature of understanding and recognizing these global connections. And so when we bring all these pieces together, it's really related to a call to action. You can simply say all those things are interesting. Maybe one day I'll visit Kigali and go to Rwanda and get these experiences that Dr. Tyner's talking about. Maybe I'll find some ways to reach 5 generations in the workplace. But I think we have to really put, if we're talking about leadership and leaders as learners, leaders as readers, we know that we also have to tangibly put on there, where are the learning points? So that's in my nature as a professor. So I've been able to use my work as a professor to teach core lessons around leadership development. So one of the things that I developed was a framework around growth and development for leaders. I break it down in 4 key categories. And then after this, I'll pause because I want to make sure I receive some questions for you to narrowly tailor my approach to provide some key tools. So this particular piece, the leadership framework for action, I look at it traditionally, we tend to focus on the intrapersonal piece, that self-discovery. So whether it's my profession as an attorney, we have elimination of bias credits. They tend to be about, how do you address bias in the legal system? All those pieces are important. Next, we start to look at the interpersonal pieces. Those are the interactions within our teams, within the chamber, with other colleagues. The third layer is the organizational piece. It's looking at how our organizations function. Now, I know most organizations have some type of DEI statement of who you are and the value proposition of diversity and what it means for you. But I think a piece of, if we're going to talk about the organizational side of it, we must have tangible, not only mission and vision statements, we have to have tangible policies, procedures, and things that we're truly taking throughout and weaving throughout our organizations to make sure the DEI is really obtainable and actualized in some meaningful ways. And of course, the societal piece. We don't have to look too far in the nature of my work around racial justice and racial equity to know that our work is not complete, to know that each of us must play a critical and strategic role in advancing the work. So if I look at it, may I give you just a couple tips on each layer? The first one on the intrapersonal piece, just a little homework for you. I'm a professor. I'd be remiss if I didn't give that invitation. If you have not taken the implicit association test by Harvard, over 20 million people have, I think they're a good starting point because most of us will say, I'm not biased. I seek opportunities to be able to connect with others. I have someone diverse in my family. I have a diverse friend. All of those things are important. But the research that we now see related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we know that the piece about bias is first that it's pervasive in many ways. That's why it's called unconscious or implicit. We don't see it directly. But the challenge for all of us is, without tangibly seeing it, without being cognizant of it, something, and we look at the research in the mind science, it's transcending past the rational dimensions of my mind, but still impacting my actions. So I hope that you can take the Harvard implicit association test and start seeing some of those biases that you may not even identify. They're everything from age to race to gender. But the only caveat that I'd ask is please be honest with yourself. You'll notice that the nature of the test is that you're making split-second decisions. That's how quickly we move throughout our business decisions, throughout our personal life. And these are the areas where there could be learning and growth because then you can challenge the bias once you're aware of it. The next piece, the interpersonal pieces, I think some of the research that I would encourage you to just draw on for some inspiration in this area, for instance, would be looking at stereotype threat and how it emerges in business transactions, how it emerges within those pieces as I talked about pipelining and diversifying talent. And you might be wondering what is stereotype threat? It was a theory that was created by Dr. Claude Steele. Initially, he was looking primarily at gender diversity, gender challenges. And what he found was, and primarily in the sciences where this research initially emerged, is that by challenging actual stereotypes, for instance, that you don't see women in science, or that only people of color and African Americans succeed in sports, that those stereotypes and biases that then turn into a prejudice oftentimes create barriers in career development for some of those talented people that if we want to make inclusion come alive, inclusion of ideas, inclusion of creating the type of atmosphere where innovation can happen, we'll be unable to do that until we address some of those hidden barriers that have lasting impact. So one of the things related to stereotype threat that I've embraced, especially as a professor, are those opportunities to identify one where I see it. And I identify it not by who likes who, that's irrelevant to me. What I'm looking at is data. I look at the data and trends where I'm not seeing representation. That's an alarm for me. And when I do see, many folks said, well, we opened the hiring process for everyone. Did you really? Where did you market the position? Was it made available to everyone? What was your process? What happened? I remember one organization in particular, I was helping them with going through hiring procedures. They didn't have a plan to reach diverse markets. Although they said they were seeking and had, of course, we all have that EEOC statement, our affirmative action plan. But what intentional efforts did we make to make sure that we had diversity in our pool? And I've also seen, oftentimes we say everything is equal and fair. I've seen whole searches closed, but then when we want our friend to work there, we open the search back up and our friend has the job. So let's look at it. I think that takes us to the organizational side, because the organizational side, it's easy to say that we are concerned about, and I'm going to take it directly here to a particular slide that I want us to look at, that we're concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we have not even embraced a strategic action plan. With every other aspect of our business, we would be concerned about how do we get to and achieve our results, whether it's about increasing revenue, whether it's about leveraging our value proposition. We have a plan, right? So when I think about this, what we're doing today is the education piece, but education alone is not going to move our organizations further. If it would have, I think in many instances, we've done enough diversity trainings, we would actually have some tangible results. I think it's also important to set forth policies, whether it's related to hiring, whether it's related to retention, whether it's related to client management, client services. What are your policies? How do they help to embrace inclusion in some meaningful ways? Here's one that I think is an obvious one, but I don't understand why we still have the challenges. In fact, there was a corporate leader that I challenged about this and publicly on LinkedIn. The individual said they believe in policies that support diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said, well, can I see your policy around pay? And many people were surprised at why I said that. But as a researcher, you see the data time and time again, that depending on the hue, depending on the gender, all of a sudden we have, although we say we're consistent, although say we're transparent, we can't accomplish one simple thing, pay parity. And why do I say it's true? Because depending on which study that you're looking at, and I'll talk about it in the two areas that I research related to race and gender, Lean In does an annual study on this, so that's helpful information. They do a Women's Pay Equity Day. And you'll see that pay parity is not a reality across regions, across disciplinary practices, because the truth be told, that Latinas, now to get on par, then they measure it across race and gender. So across race and gender means a comparison to white males. The average Latina would have to work to get pay parity for 2021 all the way until November 2022. For African American females, the pay parity would take you all the way from 2021 to August 2022. So I'm just giving you an example. Without a policy, without measuring, which is the evaluation portion, how can we say we're committed to inclusion when we haven't put in the work? Next is benchmarking. Where do you seek to go? What does success look like related to DEI? And most people don't think about this related to your business proposition. But I think it's a great misstep, because oftentimes, and I'll give the example of African Americans. When I'm in meetings, whether it's race and the economy, whatever the hot buzz topic is, race and education, we're always talking about African Americans in a deficit model. But I challenge you, if you want to be an effective business leader, have you ever thought about the fact that African Americans, our buying power alone is over $1 trillion? Could that expand your customer base, your client base in some new ways? Have you ever thought about the fact, and it's kind of funny to me, this idea that we fail to engage, the same is true for our Latinx community. Over $1 trillion of buying power. Why are we not thinking about the products and services that could serve a range of different clients, different customers in a meaningful way? If we think about this, our changing demographic, our fastest growth, well, we have, of course, since I'm in higher education, I'm studying the trends. There are some concerns within the next 10 years that there hasn't been a fast enough rate of growth to even ensure that we have enough students that will come into the freshman class. But once again, if you're not evaluating, if you're not using data-based practices that focus not only on the research, but the value-added proposition of diversity, you're missing the mark. Because if it were me getting ahead of that research, what would I be doing right now? Common sense would tell me that I would look at where's the greatest growth rate in populations. And once again, if you go back to that earlier slide, you would see that that would be within the Latinx community. You would see that you also would have to think strategically about maybe do you recruit students globally, because the fastest growth rate is in the continent of Africa. You would be thinking about innovation of technology. Can you deliver education in global context? So those pieces of the evaluation, the benchmark, have to be vital. We're thinking about them in other aspects of our business plan, but I can tell you in nearly all of the organizations that I've either studied or supported in their growth and development, none of them have a strategic plan that has actionable items as it relates to DEI. So here's one thing that I want you to think about. A part of what I've infused into all of my books is an opportunity to pause, reflect, and grow. In light of what I just said, what is one strategy that you can recommend for your workplace? And what are some things that you can do to support the implementation long-term to have a clear vision? Now, if you're not, most people think of DEI work in two paradigms. I think both of them are incomplete. It's a hybrid of both, but maybe they can inform our practice. We tend to think about it in a moral imperative, to say it's the right thing to do. Maybe to increase diversity, equity, inclusion is our way to bring forth racial justice or equity or gender justice. That's fine. Or we may look at it as a business imperative based upon the numbers that I started off with and this idea of what do we do with this buying power? How do we bring everyone together? But really the reality of it is, if we want to make a community work, if we want to make a nation work, if we want to engage in some meaningful ways, it will require for us to look at this in both contexts of how can we make business imperative? How do we make that work? How do we serve new populations? How do we create new relationships? How do we create vibrant communities? And yes, I do think it also has a component of the moral imperative. As we think about even our Declaration of Independence and our opening of our Constitution, we have we the people, and we have all men are created equal, in an inclusive way, all people are created equal. So we have some opportunities to think very strategically about DEI, but I sure hope we don't miss them. So I will leave us with just this couple things. If you need direction, I highly recommend as leaders, take a look at the CEO Action Pledge. You can actually sign on to their newsletter, get resources, but it gives you a sense of this is not just another conversation. It was lovely. I bought the book. Nice to see Dr. Tyner again. What strategically can we do to be impactful and make a difference? So look at the pledge. I just took a couple excerpts out of it, but how can you draw upon the resources, but how can you also challenge yourself as a leader? And here are some of the just general strategies. I think this piece I've talked about already, of reframing the narrative, looking at this inclusion and this equity piece in particular around emerging as the asset and the strength of a vibrant organization. I'm thinking about this. I know I talked about this broadly in the moral imperative, but I think it's a business imperative as well. As I think about it, even when I challenged the chamber, and I was grateful that you all took on the pledge to support literacy and early education, we're thinking about that as a business imperative by creating a pipeline for our future employees, our future customers, and our future community members. Seeking out learning opportunities. I hope this is not the end, because especially it would be important, maybe the chamber needs to create its own strategic action plan around DEI. I would say be open to getting out of your comfort zone. No one's going to get it right in these conversations, but the failure to have the conversation, the failure to have engagement, I think is the failed opportunity for learning and growth. And here's the piece that most Minnesotans struggle with. We say we're Minnesota nice. And we say we're polite to each other. I learned how to curtsy since I was a young girl. I learned how to fold the napkins, go through good etiquette. I can be kind to anyone. But does that mean that I honor their humanity? Does that mean that I even see them? And does it mean that I'm committed to creating a stronger Minnesota that embraces everyone? Those are different premises. And I think most Minnesotans are fine right here, but that's not leadership. That's just being, and this is actually from Langston Hughes, the great poet from the Harlem Renaissance. One of his challenges was being more than passively good-hearted. Because my friends, I don't know about you, I used to play that game Operation when I was small. I can't see your heart, can't see your brain, can't work on all your limbs. I mean, those things I cannot see, but I see the manifestation of both inaction and action. And the question for me today is, how will you lead that action? So that's the last portion of moving beyond the role of ally. And I know we're seeing a lot of discourse around that. And that's about maybe sharing some of your privilege, maybe being an advocate in certain circumstances. But really, as leaders, we can move far beyond that. And we can be those abolitionists. We can radically transform the systems. We can transform the narrative around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can make America come alive in ways like never before. So I'll pause here. That way we can get some of the engagement. I got too excited. I have so much more to share, but I want to be mindful of making sure that I'm answering specific questions that you may have.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tyner. Great presentation. I feel like I have a whole other set of questions that I could be asking you now just off of that, but I do want to step back and ask some questions that I had thought about ahead of time. And please, for others who have questions, indicate in the chat, either by putting your question in there or just mentioning you have a question. It's a small enough group. We know everybody here. Feel free to, in fact, Gail, you have a question. Why don't we go ahead and start with your question, Gail?
I do have a question. What are some good catalysts to get organizations moving beyond the numbers on diversity and just saying there's a policy, et cetera, and changing the culture? Are there some other catalysts that can kind of jumpstart so it's not such a slow, laborious process that it just gets bogged down?
Yes, I would say based upon that slide where I was outlining all these pieces, I think outlining a plan, pick one tangible item in each of these categories as a part of your annual plan. That way you're not waiting and you can't say it's too big and we won't be passively, good-hearted. Pick one thing in each category. For instance, I work with one organization. I'll give you an example. For education, they said the biggest thing that we're facing is because we're a large multinational global organization around education and how we can work across cultures. One of the things that was a common complaint from their employees was the impact of microaggressions. So we talked about what's that idea of a microaggression? What does it mean? What's the impact? Because it was slowing down productivity. They were having conflicts all the time. And so we worked on that particular piece under education. Under policy, they started talking about changeable policies because they saw a trend in their retention, that they were onboarding and bringing people in, but they weren't keeping them. So then that led us to starting to evaluate the internal processes around promotion, around access to opportunities, how is performance measured, and then benchmarking. All of a sudden, instead of them just saying, we want to be great at what we do, they knew what their value added proposition was now that they've added inclusion into the mix. So then they were benchmarking against other organizations that were at the next threshold of growth of revenues that had figured some of these components out. So all of a sudden they did have a little bit of competition for the push. If they wanted to go to the next level, they were at the crossroads. They had to make a decision. So it was something that I think a part of it is, to your point, Gail, what can ignite it? We've, in the past, in the 80s and the 90s, we start off with a good idea. We'll recruit one diverse person and we just keep it moving. The reality of it, Gail, we don't have time anymore, because if we don't figure it out, all it takes is one incident to either radically transform your business and bring it close to closure of either a behavior, a gesture. We see it. I mean, you see a whole cancel culture on Twitter and social media. And primarily, if you look at the trends, this is not my body of research. This is just me informally looking at this kind of in an anecdotal way. Typically is related to a challenge around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So I think any organization that believes they have time to figure these issues out and have the time and that people will be patient on these issues, I think you're not related to where we are in 2021 and the future beyond.
We just have to move faster. I mean, somehow ignite it. And then I think the other thing is that if an organization jumps to the organizational part without doing the interpersonal part and intrapersonal part. So, they think they know it all without doing that real interpersonal bias, facing your own demons and your own issues before moving to the organizational part. I can see that happening too.
Yes, and Gail, that's a perfect point. I think one of the challenges around the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where this continues to come up, is because we relegate it to one position. We'll say, oh, time out. If you happen to have the position, you need to talk to the chief diversity officer about that. Oh, time out. That's for the employee resource group. Now, those are all helpful tools. But as I talk about in my new book, the leader steers the ship. So if you're steering the ship and guiding it, I'm not saying that, you're going to be the CEO of your company and also be a DEI expert. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I sure better remind you that as a leader, no matter which organization you're part of it, if you do have the benefit of all those additional resources, that's great. And if you don't, this is an opportunity for you to kind of lay it out and figure out the roadmap of where you're headed. But to negate having a sense of where you're steering it, a clear mission statement, a clear vision statement, and some clear goals that you're measuring, you're correct. You're going to have some real challenges.
It looks like Kara has to leave, driving her car in a couple minutes. So Kara, why don't we get to your question? And instead of me reading it, would you mind just reciting it?
Sure. So one quick suggestion for larger organizations is to, with this new sort of movement for a lot of organizations to focus on community involvement, volunteering, getting people involved in outside activities outside of work, I think we can absolutely meet a lot of DEI objectives and move the needle if we, shape where people are volunteering, where they're getting involved, where maybe we have our leaders involved in board service, shaping that so they're getting involved in African American communities and Latina communities, et cetera, kind of shaping that. That's one idea. But also my question specifically is, do you have any suggestions for really small businesses? Because there are far more small businesses in the world actually than there are the large ones. And I think some of the ideas we've been talking about are better for large corporations that have money and have the ability to do a strategic planning around all of this, including a lot of the training and focusing their training and energy towards developing leaders and other skills in organizations. But what, from a practical standpoint, can a small business with 10 employees or 20 employees, what can they do to also help and move the needle in your experience?
I'll showcase a chamber member, Janet and BevSource. Janet and I had some of these conversations, and Janet got going. She launched the Black is Beautiful marketplace. She's been engaging her team in some meaningful ways and leveraging her gifts and talents to help challenge some of the stereotypes, the biases, but to really take tangible action. So she combined everything you just said. So she took the opportunity to say, what do we have as our strength and our asset to share with the community? Space, talent, and experience. How can this be used to continue to engage our employees? So her employees are engaged in helping to set up her Black Business is Beautiful marketplace. How do we connect with the community? It was beautiful. I've been on a range of different conversations with civil rights leaders, and they're like, do you know Janet? So that's clear that her work and her effort around engaging herself, and Janet's always sending me, she and I could run a book club together. Janet's like, have you read this study? What do you think about this? So she's having the conversation as a part of her work as being an effective leader. Now, BevSource, she's not out there. She's not a racial justice organization per se, but she raised the issue and how she could make a difference with what was in her hands to be meaningful. So I have to make sure that I give a shout out to Janet for her work in that area, managing a small business. As a small business owner myself, I make sure that it's a priority, because oftentimes people think, well, you're African American, of course you know these issues. No, I'm somebody who's passionate about these issues, study them. And as a researcher, I would be very negligent not to look closer because of the urgency of some of the racial disparities we see for the African American community. So I think a part of this, the same way I'm reading my industry work around Minnesota lawyer and looking at pending cases, the same way I pause and I start to read about what are the things happening in trends in diversity, equity, inclusion, the same way. And I'm still writing Post-it notes for my businesses. So I'll write a Post-it note and say, hey, our policy is going to be that we're going to, let's use my publishing company. We're going to donate books to 20 schools for Black History Month. I can come up with a policy just like that that helps to create some impact in some meaningful ways. Evaluate it. I'll ask myself then and bring my team together. We're a small team. There's just a couple of us. And then we'll evaluate and say, how many students did we reach? What was the impact? What's the feedback that we received? And then benchmarking to think about long-term, what type of impact do we want ongoing? And that's what led us to creating even our nonprofit, because we were interested to be able to be a part of the solution to donate books to children in need, in addition to running the for-profit side of our business. So I say all that to say it's not about size. At this point, it's really going to be about commitment and direction. And we all, oftentimes I give my student the example. We're like a choir, right? Because my grandmother was a choir director and a great soprano singer. So I always sang in church choirs. So we're like a choir. This is our hymnal book. The question is, can we all get on the same page? Now, the harmony that Chad will sing based upon his work in the chamber might be a little different. We like the tenor's voice. Maybe John brings in the baritone, bringing in the commercial real estate industry in some meaningful ways. We all better get on course. We need Gail, she can be our soprano. Somebody else, Sabrina, can be the alto. We're bringing it all together in this harmony for justice and freedom. It's going to require all of us in big and small ways. But you are correct. Some organizations have more assets. They do nothing with them. Some are doing great things with them. But I think it's a question for us individually and collectively on what we're going to build.
Well, another opportunity that a business of any size can do, Chris Ferguson isn't here right now, so I'm going to be the one to mention it. But it's not just about your hiring practices. It's also about what vendors are you using? What business are you giving to others with your business or yourself? That's another big part about how you can build that community wealth.
Thank you. That's an excellent example.
Yeah, thank you. So getting back to the book, what made you decide to write this book?
My real inspiration for the book was conversations like these. It's one thing to have as many conversations as I do in lectures and presentations all over the world. It's another thing to have a tangible piece that I can share with others. I was trying to run a coaching firm, do all these different things to reach as many people as I could. So when I thought about what would be the practical way, and I also was working within, the publisher is the American Bar Association, I was given these same challenges to the Bar Association. What could we do about justice, freedom, about equity, about moving things forward in some meaningful ways? Because once again, if you follow the data, I've been an attorney for 15 years now, you see that despite all our great efforts, we still are not diversifying the bar. We're moving by percentage point here and there. And when we look at gender diversity, yes, 50% of our classes tend to be women, but we're not seeing women go into leadership roles. We're having challenges with retention. So I just wanted to start bringing the research together that people could be able to say, I don't have to wait for a leader. I don't have to wait for someone else to bring forward change. What can I do? And it's not designed as a book that you'd read from the cover to the back. It's about getting into some of the tangible lessons that you may need in that day or that moment. I know a very prominent leader just sent me an email back and said, look, I just open up your book when I do staff meetings. I just go in and I say, okay, we'll start with this quote as an opportunity to reflect and engage and bring everyone together. Then we'll get to the rest of the business for our day. And I also wanted to say another component of this as it relates to inclusion. I was very intentional to choose quotes that were inclusive as well, that represented voices that we don't traditionally hear. Everything from looking at African proverbs, for looking at some of the key leaders like Cesar Chavez and the later labor movements. I wanted to make sure, because this piece around diversity, equity, inclusion has to be infused in all the work that we're doing. And despite all my grand efforts, despite all my commitment, I can tell you in the publishing industry, I can tell you in leadership studies, we still have not made inclusion come alive in meaningful ways. So with the book, I also wanted to be intentional to give voices. We know there's a movement in the literary community called Own Voices. I wanted to give voice to some of the diversity in leadership as well, and draw upon cultural practices to give us a broader sense of what does leadership mean.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned how somebody has told you that they like to just pull out a quote or a certain part of it. It's a book that I think it's, on one hand, it's easy to read it, but it's harder to comprehend the meaning behind it. So I think what you're illustrating there is a really great way to use this book, where you can, if you want to bring it to a meeting and say, let's focus on this quote, or let's focus on this particular topic. I think that's a great way. John, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for being here, Artika. It's good to see you
Oh,
again.
it's a pleasure. Good to see you as well.
One of the things in the book that when I read it, it really struck me, and it's that idea of fear of failure. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's got an opportunity to be in a leadership position coming up, who, she was saying that she's afraid that she wouldn't be able to do well. She would fail. And I know when I was chair of the chamber, I sweated over some of the decisions and some of the issues. And it's something that still holds me back, even though I've done, this is too much information, but I've seen counselors and I've been through all kinds of stuff in my life. So, I've learned a lot, but it still holds me back. And I think with regard to the DEI and equity and inclusion, especially in my business in commercial real estate, I mean, there's one young man, an African-American young man who's an industrial real estate broker that I know in the business out of almost 1,000. So there's just none of it's going on in my business. So it's that fear of failure that just sticks in my head. What if I don't do it right? What are other people going to think about it? And as far as I've come in my life, it still holds me back. And I don't know if you've got anything more to say about it or not, but I think it affects me and it affects a lot of people like me.
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging it, acknowledging the presence of that fear of failure. It's for all of us. I know many folks, I'm just telling my students that would never believe it, but I don't think my catalyst even for doing this type of training or public speaking didn't come until 2014. It was a challenge from a student. I told the students to apply. We were doing there was an opportunity for a TEDx talk. So I was encouraging the students. I was like, you go, I'll cheer you on. And then one of the students, Sister Elizabeth, I'll never forget it. She said, well, why don't you apply yourself? And I had every excuse in the world. I was like, I'm too busy. No, it's not right. We want students. But really what the fear of failure was, I wasn't convinced that I could tell my story or even get in front of an audience to deliver anything. I know that might be a surprise because my mother says I was born talking. That's her running joke. So I love chat 1 by 1, 2 by 2. But until 2014, I had never had the opportunity to get in front of an audience and tell it like TED, to bring forth a compelling idea that we all could work on together. So I think it's always there. But the reality of it is, had I not done that, and I'll give you just one quick example of what happened as a result. The last time I checked, over 30,000 people have listened to that TED Talk. And the emails that I still get on a daily basis of folks who have been encouraged, that want to continue the work, that, say, can I join your organization? I'm like, I don't know what organization it is. I'm just telling my little truth in my part of the world. The reason why I give that example, because if fear was the only thing that kept me bound, I would never have gotten on that stage. And why is that? And I think it's a process we all have to challenge. Why did I bring up Sister Elizabeth in that? Because she is my cheerleader and she went along with me throughout the whole process. So I think for all of us, that's an invitation. One of the things that I loved about serving on the chamber board was the community. I knew that when I was walking into an issue or trying something new as a leader, I wasn't going alone. You were only a phone call away, John. I could pick up the phone and say, John, what do you think? I could say, Chris, what do you think about this? Sabrina, what do you think about this piece? So I think you're really giving us a call. And I think it's a good reminder that it's something that we have to build together as a community. And one thing that we often don't like to talk about is also going to take a measure of empathy and grace to cover each other too. Because a part of the fear is with DEI is, what if we don't get it right?
Right.
So then we do nothing at all, or we do very little, or then we step back and live, in our shadows because we're afraid DEI and the work around racial justice work, bringing all these pieces together. There's just a lot of fear that you're not going to get it right. And that's why we need each other to bring out the holistic piece, to be able to say, when I don't know what to do in that meeting, can I ask Dr. Tyner what research she thinks I should look at? What direction the meeting should go? We're all going to have to come at this together and bring all our unique gifts and talents to make it happen, because we're all going to reach different communities, different audiences. I'm not a broker, so I'm not in the circles you're in. So, but how can we bring the information and knowledge together in some meaningful ways? But to a certain extent, I oftentimes grapple with that. And that's why I put it in the book. Do I want that fear of uncertainty to go away? Or is that fear what will keep me pushing forward to try to get a deeper understanding and work together more collectively?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
the first thing I noticed about the book is that the foreword is by John OBrien. And a few years ago, I went to the Ujama Place breakfast. They do this breakfast fundraiser every year. And I actually went because I was expecting and looking forward to hearing Dr. Artika Tyner speak. I thought you were the only speaker that day. And so I'm tweeting about it. Here, so excited to hear the keynote speaker, Artika Tyner. And you did a good job. And then after you're done, this John OBrien guy comes up and he completely blows me away. He blows the audience away. Ujama Place typically flies in a speaker. They had Dr. King's daughter one year, for example. And I went out and read the book that he wrote, How the Poor Can Save Capitalism, after hearing him speak. He's a fantastic speaker. So I'm curious, who are some other authors that we should be reading if we like the topics that you're talking about here on leadership and on inclusion? Who are some of the people we should be looking at?
John OBrien definitely is one. And since the last time he was here for Ujama Place, he's written 2 additional books, Up From Nothing. He also has Love Leadership. So his collection is amazing. And I also know, let's just be honest, not everybody has a whole lot of time. So I would recommend he has short podcasts daily to tune in and hear some of the things that he's talking about as well. So the other books that I'm currently have on my reading list, I'm reading Diversity, Inc. That looks at some of the tangible strategies that we can use around these kind of action plan pieces that I talked about. This is not a specific book per se, but I'm also following one of the organizations that I'm doing a case study of is Intel. Because what I like about Intel is that they actually, to Gail's point, they publish annually their progress on their strategic action plan. So by publishing it publicly annually, there's a certain level of accountability that comes with it. So I would highly recommend looking at kind of the process and procedure that Intel has used over time to increase diversity in meaningful ways. So for me, I think the podcasts that I'm seeing are excellent. I follow the work of both PBS and TPT. For all the great movies. You have Slavery by Another Name. Also, there's a great movie that I watched last night on Netflix called Crack. It's about the crack cocaine epidemic. Very eye-opening because oftentimes we talk about it and we just see a black face and we hear Hillary Clinton talking about super predators. We just get all over the place. This was one of the first opportunities where it really focused on economics. So I think as business owners, as leaders, I think that's a critical movie to watch, to see what has happened and change the landscape of our nation and our local economies, and not just looking at crack, connecting it then to some of the challenges around today where we are with the opioid crisis. So that was very informative. So for me, maybe it's kind of an eclectic type of view. I'm watching movies about the issues. I'm reading blogs. I like I said, I like the blogs from Korn Ferry. I'm tuning in to listen to folks like John OBrien. I also, like you mentioned, the King Center, Dr. Bernice King daily puts out great content. Look at also museums. The National African American Museum posts wonderful information, along with locally our Minnesota African American Museum as well.
Right. We're getting short on time, but I want to ask you, what are the biggest takeaways that you want people to get from reading your book?
I think the biggest takeaways from reading the book are, one, I think actually how it's organized. Why lead? You have to have your own story at the forefront of why you're doing what you're doing. What do you seek to see? What's your vision of community? What's your vision of a healthy, vibrant economy? What's your vision for our children? Because oftentimes you're like, that's my child, that's someone else. No, our children. As leaders, we have to think about that very strategically. I think also begging that question about what are your unique gifts and talents. We all, as we think about what we can impact, we have a culmination of certain skills. And if you don't know what they are, there are plenty of assessments like StrengthsFinder that can help you identify those top 3 to 5 strengths to get a sense of what you can bring to the table. Now, of course, for me, mine are related to input, relational, and learner. Makes perfect sense because it means that I'm in the data. It means that I'm analyzing best practices. It means that I love working with people to implement those ideas. So imagine if I was doing something that did not draw upon my strengths. then you cannot bring your best to the rest of the world. So bring your best. It's not just about the DEI conversation. I think for the business proposition to have a vibrant and strong economy, strong democracy, all those pieces, civic engagement, is going to require you and I to bring our best to the table. And we have to be willing to know. I think the main portion that I conclude with is about that leadership DNA, that it's as unique as your actual physical makeup. How do you bring that DNA into every setting that you're in and to be as impactful as possible? And last but not least, is oftentimes overlooked. I alluded to it, but I do think that this is a very specific call to action. In the conclusion, I talk about the late Dr. Monroe. Before he passed away, it was almost like he was prophetic and gave his own eulogy. If you don't know him, he was very active, of course, in his faith community, but more broadly in supporting local economies, providing jobs, opportunities, and supporting youth and education. And one of the things that he talked about is success without a successor is a failure. Success without a successor is a failure. And if you remember anything about his tragic death, most of his family was lost on that flight together. And so I wrote the conclusion after listening to his sermon, because the editors kept saying, where's your conclusion? It just never came to me. But that piece about success without a successor is a failure. I think that's important for leaders to have in mind. Who are you pouring out? Who are you teaching these skills to? But then the challenge, this is where you go a bit step further if we put the DEI into the mix a bit. Don't let it just be those traditional folks that you would encounter on a day-to-day basis within your network. I wouldn't be sitting here today as Dr. Tyner without a culmination of, I call them my boards of directors, who came together to support me, to create an opportunity, to open up doors, to be those champions, be those sponsors, be those coaches. Who are you doing that for? And make sure that it's not just somebody who shares the same interest and passion as you do. That's helpful. Make sure that they only share the same cultural background. That's helpful too. But how can you expand it to be able to bring in that inclusion proposition, to bring in maybe that unlikely person who has all the talent and potential that's missing one thing, because talent and potential by itself will not move you forward. You also need the opportunity to showcase it. So how can you create that for someone else?
Great. Well, always good stuff, Dr. Tyner. I always wish we could talk longer because you always have such interesting topics that you cover and bring up things that I know I wouldn't have thought of on my own. I'm gonna, in the follow-up email that I sent to everybody on the event, I'm gonna send a link with Dr. Tyner's information that will link up to her YouTube channel and other resources that she has. Any final thoughts before we leave, Dr. Tyner?
Well, my final thought is here's our opportunity to redefine leadership in some meaningful ways. So I encourage you not to think of this as a destination, that we just had this conversation today, but that you really use this as a journey of exploration, a journey of connection, and a journey of building together. So thank you for your input. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. And it's a blessing to walk and lead right beside you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's awesome. Have a good day, everybody.